Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Welcome, and we deeply appreciate you making time in your busy lives for this panel and for this important work. I'm honored to be hosting this event alongside all of today's panelists. Thank you to the Bates Office for Equity and Inclusion for making this event possible. I'm Dan Sanford. I'm the Director of Writing at Bates. I'm a linguist. What I love so much about the study of language is that language is a powerful lens for studying any aspect of the human experience, because every aspect of the human experience is mediated through language. There's nothing we do that's more human than opening our mouths or using our hands and having words come out. I also love that for studying a culture or a community, looking at the way that speakers and signers use language is this incredibly potent way of understanding that culture. The flip side of that coin is that the ugliest parts of our society are also reflected in language. Some aspects of this are right there on the surface. The discourse of hate is threaded throughout our nation's past, and every painful step of the history of discrimination in the United States is crystallized in the language that we use today. We're here to focus today, however, on some of the aspects of this that are harder to see, that may not be apparent on the surface. One of the most amazing things about language is that so much of our knowledge of it is entirely implicit. Speakers and signers can be fluent and skilled language users without being able to articulate or even consciously know the rules that structure their language. And much in the same way, the way that language functions in society is governed by language users' attitudes about language, which also often exist at an unconscious level. This creates enormous space for bias, both explicit and implicit. This has enormous and profound implications for higher education, where everything we do takes place through language. And this has enormous and profound implications for academic writing, which is a form of writing that's highly structured according to implicit and often racially coded ideas about what makes writing good. I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of panelists who will add their insights to these discussions. Dr. Noel Chaddock, Bates Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Stephanie Wade, Assistant Director of Writing at Bates, and Dr. Bridget Fullerton, Assistant Director of Writing at Bates, who will be moderating the panel portions of the discussion. 3 members of the faculty will be speaking to their experiences navigating language boundaries and race in their own education, and how they teach in ways informed by these experiences and by the scholarship of multilingualism. Dr. Ewan Garrison from the Department of Psychology, Dr. Ian Cara-Elisante from Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Dr. Jacqueline Lyon from Anthropology. 3 further panelists will help us understand how anti-racist approaches to writing intersect with particular areas of Bates. Bates student and ARC peer educator Eliana Alcansul, Bates Director of Equity and Inclusion Education Nicolette Mitchell, and Assistant Dean of Accessible Education and Student Support Abigail Nelson. Thank you to all of our speakers. After we've heard from everyone, there will be plenty of time at the end of the session for all of you who have joined us today to chime in with your insights and questions. And here to kick things off is Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Noel Chaddock.
Thank you so much, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good evening. It's nice to see all of you. Thank you for being here. I just have a short few things that I wanted to say. I was excited to have the opportunity to talk about language and lingual cultural realities as part of our equity and inclusion and anti-racism thinking. For me, language has always been an access issue. And I think we think about that sometimes in a transactional way. Does someone need a translator? Does someone need materials in a different language? And then, of course, sign language. I think we have those things down. What I would hope folks would think about as our panelists speak with us tonight are the ways in which we're creating exclusive spaces based on language and lingual cultural realities. So we think about, in critical race theory, which is my discipline, we think about things like, African-American vernacular English. And I think that's the one that most folks are most familiar with as a way of both signifying where someone comes from, the way they engage the world, how they recognize each other, and their ways of framing and naming things. I shared a story with this panel when we were getting together that I wanted to share with you all this evening around how I actually came to understand linguistic difference and the need for inclusion and access around language and lingual cultural realities. It was a young man in my first teaching job who came from Africa, and one day he was having really hard time with his writing, and he came to me and he said, I have always been an A student. I've always been top of my class. I get to college and I'm failing, which is always one of the most upsetting things that I hear from students, because it's this clear message that they don't belong in college and that they aren't grasping academic language. As he and I sat working on one of his papers one night, he got a phone call and he started speaking to the person in French. And he hung up the phone, and I don't know why I asked him, but I asked him how many languages he spoke. And he said, well, 6, and he rattled off 6 different languages. And it was at that point that it struck me, my own deficiencies. I'm a monolingual, single language speaker. And this country and the academy allows someone like me to be successful and get a PhD. But someone like Abdul is deemed deficient, sent for remedial assistance and support, and is continually told that his expression of ideas is not fitting the language of the classroom in the academy. And that struck me as really dissonant, that someone who has the capacity to speak 6 languages, which means speaking 6 languages, thinking in 6 different languages, and expressing himself across those languages in particular ways, that could be and deemed in any way deficit. And so I started really thinking as I moved into equity and inclusion work proper, and now as we're thinking about equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, is how to locate our work and thinking around people's achievements and successes. How do we celebrate and create room for someone like Abdul, who could speak 6 languages, instead of stripping him down in ways that not only makes his multilingualism, which seemed to come like effortlessly to this human, ended up going on learning a 7th language and still teaching in Japan. I still only speak English. So I just find that, I don't know, that has framed something for me. I also find that students, as I've worked from student affairs through the vice presidency, one of the things we're missing by not kind of peeling back the boundaries of language and lingual cultural realities is that we are boxing folks into spaces where they cannot communicate with us, right? And we don't create space for folks to emote, express, feel in the language that they think and love in, and when they have a critical moment, crises, the language that they're thinking in. And so the frustration that folks have in trying to access resources, and I would say especially parents who are calling the institution trying to find out what's going on with their young person, trying to figure out how to get resources for them. And the person on the other end of the phone is someone like me, Dr. Chaddock, who can only speak 1 language. So that's what I really wanted to help kick us off with thinking about, is that these are not just transitional and functional conversations and narratives this evening. These are possibilities. How do we start to stretch ourselves as an industry in our classrooms and in our co-curricular support services? How do we do better work? How do we hold ourselves to a higher standard around our own language access, and how we are evaluating and causing valuative measures spaces, most of which are exclusive for multilingual folks. So that's all I have for now. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to pass it back to you, Dan.
Great. Thank you so much, Noel. I'd like to say a few words to frame this discussion on language attitudes, on racism, and on standards for academic writing. Languages vary. There's a staggering amount of variation in how human languages are structured, how they conceptualize the world, how they encode information, the way that units like words or sentences play out, how tense and aspect are handled. everything. Everything that language does, it does differently in different languages. What all languages have in common is that they're equally systematic, equally rule-based, equally good at getting across the ideas that their speakers want to convey. Languages have dialects. All of us speak a dialect. Within a language, dialects vary in all the ways that languages vary. So all dialects are equally systematic, equally rule-based, equally good at getting across the ideas that their speakers want to convey. All language varieties, different languages, different dialects, are equally systematic, equally rule-based, equally good at getting across the ideas that their speakers want to convey. Like in every field, linguists love to argue, and there are deep divisions among us. These ideas are universally agreed on. They are incontrovertible. You can't dig into linguistic structure and not find these principles at work. But within a society, people have very strong ideas about which language varieties are better or worse. People have a lot of ideas about which language varieties are most logical or beautiful or systematic or correct. Invariably, these ideas don't reflect anything inherent to language varieties. They reflect attitudes that people have towards the speakers of those language varieties. More often than not, they reflect power dynamics. In colonization scenarios, for example, it's nearly always the case that the language of the colonizing group comes to be thought of over time as correct and defining standards for correctness. Within a society, it's the language varieties that are native to those who have the most wealth, power, and influence that come to be thought of as correct and come to define our ideas of correctness. Language attitudes are deeply tied to race, deeply tied to colonialism, and deeply tied to socioeconomic status. The colonial languages of the US are the languages with the highest prestige in the US, French, English, and Spanish. They're winners and losers within that group, reflecting the history of speakers of English winning struggles for economic and political control over speakers of Spanish and French within the US. An overwhelming number of indigenous languages have died. Those that are alive remain so in the face of overwhelming pressure for their speakers to switch to English, and only through heroic efforts on the part of Native communities to preserve their cultural heritage. The same can be said of many heritage language communities and immigrant language communities in the United States. The United States is large and has many linguistic influences. We have a wealth of regional and cultural dialects of English. There are many dialects of English that are strongly associated with race and with ethnicity. Most profoundly, African American Englishes reflect the long history of isolation of speakers of African American English from other English speakers through control and subjugation, through political structures, through subjugation, through segregation. In language, isolation leads to difference. And there are sweeping systematic differences between the language varieties collectively known as African American Vernacular English and other varieties of English. There are also dialects strongly associated with class in the United States, not race. For example, Appalachian English. But the contempt that many speakers of English hold for speech varieties in which, for example, the coffee cold or I ruck the leaves are grammatical utterances have nothing to do with correctness and everything to do with classism and racism. In the US, there's another strong language attitude that very much shapes how issues of language play out. There's a strong attitude that there can only be one language. There is an assumption of monolingualism. Every society has language attitudes, but many societies, many countries do not operate with this particular assumption. In many societies and many countries, multilingualism is common and widely accepted. There is not an assumption that there can be only one language of national dialogue or that children need to grow up speaking just one language. Higher education was, until very recently in world history, the sole purview of affluent white men. Assumptions of whiteness, affluence, and maleness pervade the academy. We're all grappling with this legacy. Writing is language. It's a powerful case where language attitudes, many of them explicitly racist and classist, are encoded in our standards for academic writing. Our ideas about correctness, about grammaticality, about what we value in writing, and about the language varieties that are fit for the academy are all intimately tied up with racist, classist language attitudes. The speech varieties that are valued in academia, which we collectively label standard academic English, has its norms and rules established by the norms and rules of the English spoken by affluent white Americans. The effect of that is, if you're a student from a white or affluent community, then you're a native speaker of a language variety that is valued within the academy, and your native fluencies align closely with rules for correctness. That is a powerful form of privilege. If you're a student from a heritage language community, an immigrant background, a non-US background, a community of color, or a community of non-affluence, it's highly likely that your native language fluencies do not line up with what is valued in the academy. Anti-racism calls on us to dismantle discriminatory racist systems. Here we have a clear case of one. It's at the center of everything we do. We can teach writing in a way that dismantles the system, elides privilege, and embraces multilingualism and multidialectalism. The cost of entry is a willingness to let go of some of our assumptions about what it means to teach writing and what it looks like to teach writing. Thank you, and I'll hand off to Stephanie Wade.
Thank you, Dr. Chaddock, and thank you, Dr. Sanford, for your framing remarks. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us. I'm going to share my screen because I have prepared a visual to take us through anti-racism and the teaching of writing in 5 minutes. I have 3 points to add from my field of writing studies to this discussion. The first point is a tremendous body of research going back many decades affirms the value of language diversity in the classroom. My second point, very few people know about this research, and those who do have typically been introduced to it through code switching, which is an approach that misapplies this research and perpetrates harm. And 3, translingual practices and code meshing offer a way forward. I would like us to linger for a minute in this statement from 1974, Students' Rights to Their Own Language. This is the statement that my field used to affirm the value of language diversity. I'll just read it to you. It's 47 years old, and we can think about how much all of us need to continue to heed this call. We affirm the students' right to their own patterns and varieties of language, the dialects of their nurture, or whatever dialects in which they find their own identity and style. Language scholars long ago denied that the myth of a standard American dialect has any validity. The claim that any one dialect is unacceptable amounts to an attempt of one social group to exert its dominance over another. Such a claim leads to false advice for speakers and writers and immoral advice for humans. A nation proud of its diverse heritage and its cultural and racial variety will preserve its heritage of dialects. We affirm strongly that teachers must have the experience and training that will enable them to respect diversity and uphold the rights of students to their own language. I'll share a link to this with you shortly so that you can look over the 40 pages of bibliographies that support this statement. And if we reflect on our experiences, I think we could see how important it is today that we heed this call. Unfortunately, the dominant way in which this call has been heeded in my field is through code switching. Code switching creates spaces for students' home languages and dialects, but only in some genres like personal writing, and only in some stages of the writing process, such as the early stages, generating material. And then code switching directs writers to switch to a version of standard edited white American English for their formal work. This code switching was how I was trained to teach writing. But research in translingualism and code meshing has taught me to see the flaws in this approach. Translingualism is a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift from monolingualism that Dan mentioned, and it's rooted in changes in technology, migration, and our understanding of language. This shift requires us to acknowledge that communication transcends different languages and communication transcends words. Code switching enforces and reifies illusionary and harmful hierarchical boundaries between languages. Those boundaries aren't there if you look at the way the dialects relate to each other on the ground, but code switching makes them seem separate. Code meshing is a translingual practice that acknowledges the impact of racism and implicit bias on literacy practices. One of my favorite scholars in the field says it like this, using code meshing in her work. April Baker Bell writes, despite decades of research on Black language, its survival since enslavement, and its linguistic imprint on the nation and the globe, Black people and Black language scholars keep having to remind y'all that it is a legit language. Vershawn Ashanti Young and his team review research that illustrates correlations with the older code switching pedagogies and reduced self-esteem. Their research also reveals that judgments about language are often inflected with racism. And they review many examples of code meshing where writers successfully combine various dialects in public, academic, and political discourse. They conclude, our students are each gifted in the experiences they bring to the classroom, and our pedagogy should never close the door by limiting the way our students share their lives and their learning. And we can begin to apply this research right away. Carmen Kennard offers one way to do this. She says, hip hop teaches us, when in doubt, always stay fly. You do not give up who you are to be an academic writer. On the contrary, you take who you are even more seriously. So what does this mean for us at Bates? Immediately, we can practice reading from a standpoint of curiosity and humility so as to learn more about various dialects. Rather than assuming writers are making mistakes, we should honor their choices and ask them questions to help them see further choices. We should read works in a range of dialects, and we should sign up to continue this work together. I will share a link for you to do that later. And now I will turn this over to Bridget Fullerton, who will ask some questions of our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Wade, Dr. Sanford, and Dr. Chaddock for that framing for our panelists, Dr. Garrison, Dr. Elisante, and Dr. Lyon. And I'm just gonna put the first question out there, which is, what language varieties did you grow up with? And maybe Yun, would you like to start? Sorry, Dr. Garrison.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Yun Garrison. My real name is No Yun Kyung. It's important that I say my name in the way my ancestors and my family say. The language that I grew up is Korean. Growing up in South Korea, when I was invited to this talk, I was thinking, like, I'm actually afraid to sound like knowing more than I actually know about this topic. And I really reflected on like why this universe invited for me to speak about this topic. And I was able to kind of recover some historic memory about why this topic is really relevant to my own work and life. Yeah, so when it comes to Korean language, my grandmother, it's a short story, but I'll share a little bit. My grandmother, she lived through Japanese colonization where her literal linguistic identity was taken away. When she spoke Korean, she had to be cautious because otherwise police will arrest her, put it in her jail. So I know that linguistic oppression, and through her story, I learned that language is how we can, live a life freely and fully through her story. And when it comes to academics, she has no academic background through any institutions because she had no schooling experiences at all. However, she is the most academic person that I have ever met in her life because of her linguistic freedom and empowerment. So she never learned how to read and write Korean, but she self-taught, like how to write some Korean languages. But what's so interesting, one of the variety that she taught me was oral Korean, not written Korean. So she has to listen to herself as she reads. So whenever she reads newspaper, she's almost creating a new chant or a song to like blue sky. Like she's creating almost like a song as a like oral Korean. That's another language variety that I am very, very familiar thanks to my grandmother. And I was also connecting to my father, my father born in and raised, during Korean War, born as a homeless person, but he ended up studying, linguistics, pragmatics. I'm like, oh my God, I never thought about that he had that kind of background because we never talked about that hard topics at all, but it makes sense. I have some connection to this topic through my grandmother and father. And the most important person that I need to mention is my older brother who had Down syndrome, who had intellectual disability, who had a multiple variety of Korean. People say he used broken Korean, a lot of deficit language, and he died in 2010. And he requested me to publish his diary. He wrote diary in his broken Korean for 13 years. Beautiful, powerful, empowering voices. So when I was editing that book, his diary, I decided to publish as the way he spoke instead of not editing any Korean grammar, the way he spoke, because preserving itself is his voice, and that is what society needs to really learn and listen. And myself right now as a linguistic minority who speaks Korean and English, and I always remember these three people who have taught the linguistic liberation that allowed me to speak my own truth in academic settings, and also empowering students who may not have the access to standard English, white English, and those who are resisting to speak that English. Yeah, so that's kind of my general background about my language varieties.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. And I forgot to sort of ask for some opening remarks, so I apologize for diving right into that first question, but thank you so much for answering it so gracefully. Dr. Alicante, do you have a couple opening remarks, and feel free to go into that first question if you'd like. What language varieties did you grow up with?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm Ian Carr Alicante. My pronouns are they, them. And I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, in a Black family in which I was surrounded by African-American vernacular English always. My parents and grandparents are from the Mississippi Delta region, what we now think of as the Mississippi Delta region. And so that's the dialect of English that I knew, that I know. It still remains the sound of home for me. It's the way of speaking and communicating that still feels just like home. And of course, African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, is a marginalized dialect. It arises from a specific context of oppression, and it's stigmatized. It's associated with Black people, and so therefore, all of the myriad stereotypes that are anti-Black are also associated with this dialect. And so for me, that was my home language, and it still is. But as I grew older and began to interact in the world in settings in which my language and style of speaking were suddenly noteworthy, people might make neutral remarks about an accent or a particular way I said a word. And that was at best. Often though, I would have these realizations that there was something wrong about the way that I was talking. And I found that I was edited very often in my spoken communication. And I saw it also happening to my loved ones as well. Um, um, that only had to happen a few times before I began to edit myself. And that still shows up in the way that I speak. It shows up in the ways that I teach. I hear myself say a word in a particular way, and I can feel my mouth forming the word in the way that I would say it if I were home. And I edit. I stop and edit myself in ways that feel um, really disempowering. And so I'll say that when I started to encounter writers like Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston and the poet Lucille Clifton, encountering that type of writing is a way that really helped me re-legitimize as a younger person this style of speaking, of hearing, and of communicating. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lyon?
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. I think it's really inspiring already to hear from everyone. And just, I guess I'm thinking about some connections with what everyone else is saying. I usually, as Ian sort of said, I usually like preface my classes like, I'm from Chicago, like it's very obvious, like I have a thick accent. Because I'm self-conscious a little bit about how I pronounce certain words, or I'm having such a thick, marked, I think, accent, which, you know, as hard as I try, is just with me, and sometimes I feel a little bit out of place for how marked my Chicago accent is, even you know, if it's, you know, from the U.S. Just having a strong accent is just something that I always sort of like mark at the beginning of a course. And then in thinking about where I grew up, so I grew up in Chicago in a family of Puerto Rican descent. And again, building off of what Dr. Garrison sort of talked about, in thinking about the colonial impact on language, especially for Puerto Ricans, who are largely bilingual because of US colonization of the island, and sort of speaking largely Spanglish, right, at home, but also having those same experiences where I'm a first generation to college student, and knowing that, you know, I'm number 7 out of 8 kids, the first to graduate college out of my siblings, and knowing that my siblings who never sort of enrolled in higher education were some of the smartest people I had ever known. My mom is like a huge reader. I grew up with books all throughout my house, and knowing that these kinds of models that they were telling me in school about what intelligence was or what it looked like, I would go home and my siblings would like set me straight, and my mom would set me straight a little bit on some of the things I was learning in school. And I guess I encountered in undergrad the work of Gloria Ansaldúa, which students of mine, I assign her in virtually every class, because she writes not only in a very personal way, but mixes languages, right? Spanish, English, Nahuatl, which is an indigenous language. And encountering her work really showed me that I didn't have to sort of choose a path, right? That there's multiple paths that I could go in pursuing academia, which felt like, you know, maybe I had to give up something, right, in order to pursue a career in academia. And she sort of showed me a different way, or an alternative.
Thank you. Our next question is, if you'd like to talk about some of your most poignant memories of learning to write in academic settings. Those can be memories of being included or excluded because of language and culture. Dr. Garrison, do you mind beginning again?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I have so many memories, so I don't know where to begin, to be honest. Yeah, I internalized a lot of deficit narrative about being a non-native English speaker. The nativity, was for some reason so important because, the minute I speak, people detect my accent. They immediately lean forward because they're expecting the speaker's failure to communicate. But right now I have a different idea. They lean forward because they know that they're gonna fail to understand the English varieties. So right now I have a different perspective, but initially I internalized a lot of deficit narrative about my language. Of course that narrative internalized native speakerism, which I'll talk about later, makes me feel small, make my small voice quieter, and I couldn't really speak freely in my academic writing because I always know that people are going to come and correct it. This is not how you speak. This is not a valid way of approaching topic because you're not speaking the right English. So I have experienced that a lot. Throughout my graduate school training, I had a humongous privilege working with writing center, collaborative writing center writers, those who are very informed by anti-oppressive writing pedagogy. So initially I went there, I know my writing is already fault, so fix this, you know how to fix. And they really, really helped me to find my own grammar, my own ways of speaking, my own ways of writing. So that was one of my, important memory that I wanted to share. When I was in the place of deficit space, I couldn't really speak about my intellectual curiosity and cultural curiosity because I was so confined in that, standard English syntax. But once I have established a new relationship with my, English as it is right now with a lot of Korean accent, I was able to explore a lot more about my ideas, actually doing, more studies involving Korean culture, Asian American community members, international, student community members as well. Um, yeah, so I think, my regaining my own linguistic justice really allowed me to work toward my epistemic liberation, and that's how I also approach in my teaching. Without linguistic justice, we cannot really think freely. We cannot really write freely. So that is another memory that I have. Yeah, I have another memory which will be quick. Taking TOEFL exam, GRE exam as someone who does not speak English at home, that was thinking that it was traumatic, I think, because that's what I got the message that, oh my God, I will never become a good writer because this form is not allowing me to be myself on the page. So I know there are a lot of conversations about, that kind of standardized English, writing exams. But for me, that was very unhelpful because that form really dictates how I should think instead of my feelings, my experiences, my cultural identities dictating the content and forms and styles. So I think overall, my memories are all around, how I work toward linguistic justice and epistemic liberation. Yeah, and I experience a lot of loss because the more I live in this context, I'm worried that I may lose my Korean accent in my speaking and also writing, and I really really try to. I want to keep my Korean accent in my writing, and I want to keep my linguistic identity in my interaction with other people. Yeah, so that is some of my memory that I wanted to share here with you. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Well, Dr. Lyon, I'll switch it up a little.
I guess I want to share maybe a positive experience because I do think, I had some really great teachers that really set me on a good path, and that I'm still sort of being inspired by. First is the professor who gave me the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, and then also took me to my first academic conference where inspired by Ansel Doa's work, I had written something that was, based on my own. It was sort of like a beginning of a self-ethnography, right, or a sort of self-study. And so professors like that one, and then later as a student in anthropology, who really tried to encourage me to place myself right in the writing. And that's something that I think, at least in my field, and then in my teaching, that is really important, is thinking about challenging this idea of this distanced objectivity, right, that we're often taught to reproduce, and really sort of placing the self as a feeling, living, breathing being, within a specific historical and also, cultural context. And so I think those lessons that I've learned to try to develop my own voice and my own identity, and place myself in my writing as a sort of embodied, source of knowledge, right, has been really empowering. And I credit sort of, feminist scholars, Black feminist scholars, women scholars of color for, those lessons.
Thank you, Dr. Asante.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, Dr. Lyon, Dr. Garrison, thank you. Very inspiring. Yeah, so I think I was talking before about feeling feeling like I needed to edit myself and constantly edit myself in terms of my speaking, and how over the years that editor has become internalized. And when I discovered writing, though, as a very young person, I realized that, this is where it's at. That for me, I can use writing, I can express myself in a way where there are no dialect police. I can I can explore my own voice and use my own voice. And again, I mentioned Alice Walker, the poet Lucille Clifton, Zora Neale Hurston, and the like. And I realized, there are models for this. And it really helped me to be able to realize that the way that I hear English, the way that I speak English, like it's legit. So yeah, writing for me, I think creative writing first and foremost has been where I feel that I most comfortably both express and hear my own voice. And academic writing for me is a step beyond that. But in just my free writing, which I tend to call my medicinal writing, which is a daily practice for me, it really has helped me to lose that editor, to really get myself free of that editor that sometimes shows up in my writing. And that in turn has informed the way I feel about how I speak. I feel quite unapologetic about my voice. No one can communicate in the way that I communicate or say the things that I say. Um, yeah, and so Dr. Garrison, you made a point that really resonated with me. I do not want to lose my accent. I am losing my accent. Every time I go home, I realize how I realize the distance that's there between how I now communicate and the way I sound versus how my loved ones and my people at home sound. Um, and yeah, for a few years after I left Memphis, I actually tried to stop saying y'all. And I realized for me and the ways that I communicate, there is no substitute for the word y'all. So I gave up trying to replace that, but it was a lesson for me. And I had to take a step back and really think through who is this for? Why am I working to give up something that feels deeply inherent to how I know? And so, yeah, I think that's a roundabout way, hopefully, of answering that question. That for me, writing has been a way of of freeing, of getting free of those editors.
Thank you so much. We have one more question, and we want to leave a little time for the respondents to talk too. So maybe we could be a little more brief in this section, and maybe even tend to the question again once we go into more opening it up to the audience. But the question is, how do you attend to multilingualism in your teaching? Dr. Lyon, do you mind starting?
Yeah, I think at least in the field of anthropology, I teach a W2, which I'm teaching right now, actually. And I assign works like Zora Neale Hurston, and we talk about how the language that she presents the work is actually a fundamental part of her argument, right? Or her mission for her work. We read Barracoon sections from that in the last 2 years I've taught this course. And it's a work that she refused to publish because they wanted her to edit the language in which it was presented. And so we talk about those questions and those issues in writing. Also, as an advisor of theses in the Latin American and Latinx Studies program as well. The two theses I've advised are students who write works that, you know, they bring questions of, can I write in Spanish, right? And sort of making spaces and allowing students to write in the language that feels right to them, and being an advisor that encourages them to do that. And so we can get into more in the question and answer, but I would love to hear everyone else's responses.
Dr. Elisante?
Yeah, so in my courses, we focus really heavily. We spend the first week or so on positionality, and we spend, you know, the rest of the time in everything that we're doing, learning how to be self-reflective. And we do that through discussion, we do it through writing. And I really want students to write from their own experience, how from their position they are connecting or not with the topics that we're exploring. And I realized that in making this ask of them, I'm asking them to shed layers, especially in an academic setting in which they may not be writing like this in other courses. And when they do that, when they show up in that way, one of the things I realize is that one of the layers that's one of the first to be shed is this fallacy that they have to write in conventional English or conventional American English in order to demonstrate their learning. And I applaud that. I applaud when that layer gets shed because I find that I'm asking them to demonstrate their learning in a way that might remind them of home. And I want to hear those connections. And sometimes that means that they need to communicate in a language or in a dialect that isn't the typical language or dialect we hear around here.
Dr. Garrison?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I am feeling so excited hearing what you have shared so far. Yeah, you know, I teach in psychology, and psychology has a really particular way of writing conventionally in a dominant, you know, psychology setting. So I start from disrupting that narrative together. So, you know, I share how that particular way of writing is so limited, which only serve, you know, white cisgender, you know, middle class, wealthy scholar community. It doesn't even serve communities who really need knowledge and empowerment. So I always start from there, you know, how our language is also positioned in the racial hierarchy that is again positioned in, you know, linguistic hierarchy as well. So I invite my students to write as freely as possible, and some of the initial draft will mirror the societal linguistic oppression because that's what they feel comfortable and accustomed to. And we move toward really like this language should be the mirror of your inner world that is hungry and thirsty of liberation, you know, multiple ways of knowing. So we are making some movement from disrupting, acknowledging the linguistic oppression toward more liberatory writing. So I do a lot of free writing. One of my friends, said, the first thought is the best thought. The first answer is the best answer. So allow ourselves to be so free and allow ourselves to explore our rawness in terms of language. And then we can figure out how we can really find the authentic writing voice. Academic conventional community may not like the voice, but who cares? Like, I have, I tend to be resistant about that so that I can model that. It's okay. It's more than okay. It's actually what our society exactly needs so that we can really honor multiple ways of writing, multiple ways of knowing. I also mentioned native speakerism, especially me as an international person who learned English, began speaking English in my late 20s. I recently did some study about native speakerism, so I mentioned that part because we have some international students who are struggling with that kind of deficit language narrative. So I focus on pragmatics. It's not about grammar. It's not about grammatical accuracy. It's about your ability to communicate successfully. That pragmatics matter in our writing. And it's not about determination. There's no preconceived notion of language. It's about your agency. It's your ability to shape the language in the way you want to express. That is your agency. I want to see that in your writing. Another thing is, I think Dr. Lyon mentioned about kind of like hybrid. We are resisting the notion of language as a pure, the purity, the correct way. No, that's false. That's a myth. Language is hybrid, so your ability to associate other languages, if you speak Korean, mix it up, that's how you communicate your ideas. So I really value hybrid. If students speak other languages like Spanish or French, you're gonna make this work because of based on your agency and the value of hybridity. So in my writing, I tend to share my own positionality about how I approach linguistic diversity.
Thank you so much. That's inspiring and eye-opening. I'd like to turn here to our next group of panelists to respond to some of these ideas and also speak to how they play out in your quarters of the college. And can we start with Nicolette Mitchell?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much, Dan, Stephanie, and Bridget for facilitating this conversation. Just as Professor Garrison just ended with saying that she's particularly excited about how the conversation is going, I share that sentiment. So thank you to all the panelists that have spoken so far. So far, I mean, you all gave me so many things to think about. I have been taking notes and they are not organized at all, but I've been picking apart what's rising up for me. One of the themes that have come up is, the monoculturalism and monolingualism is global, and white supremacy and the impacts of colonialism are global. I've been thinking about my own entry into academia. And my first dialect was actually Patois. I'm from Jamaica. And so even in the context of going to school in a whole different country, as soon as I started going to school, I was being taught how to speak proper British English, how to write that way. And I think it shows up, I think I appreciated Professor Garrison's reflections on what it meant to be an international student and to come to the United States, but thinking about how that's happening in our classrooms every day, and perhaps also happening not just in the context of the classroom, but in how we talk to one another as colleagues and peers, as faculty and staff, and as students outside of the classroom. And so how white supremacy in particular shows up in our institutional and cultural norms has been something I've been thinking about. And when having you all reflect on language as an expression of culture, one of the ways that we're expressing culture is how we treat each other and how we relate to one another. And so in the work of training and having folks think about what the work of equity means, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to disrupt exactly what we're talking about here in the classroom in the way that we treat each other and see one another. So some of the things that you all said that particularly stood out to me, Professor Elisante, you talked about how you only had to be edited a few times for you to learn how to edit yourself and for that voice to be internalized. And I thought about, we've been thinking about the academic impact of having to conform, but there's also a psychic impact to that, and how that plays into retention and persistence for folks, for students, but also for faculty and staff who enter into predominantly white institutions, who enter into academia, who have to learn how to write with academic conventions. So something that Professor Garrison said, talked about preserving the voices of people, preserving that language and the way that people actually speak. I think in academic environments, we tailor ourselves so much, like, speaking at a meeting, you have to make sure that, okay, I'm going to show up today and I'm going to speak this way so that I am understood. What would it mean? What would it look like for us to begin to break that down? I'm asking all these hard questions, but this is where I live. Dr. Chaddock talked about how the assumptions of a norm is exclusion, and in our language, but also tons of other ways that norms are expressed. Dr. Lyon talked about talking about seeing and having writers who disrupt the norm, gave you an alternative to having to give up a part of yourself. And that spoke to me. Thinking a lot about, what do we expect people to give up when we assume that there is only one right way? And who's doing the giving up, and and how does that play out as a power struggle? So there were tons of really, really, really good points. And thank you all for sharing. I am gonna yield the floor because I want to make sure that we get to Q&A, but I am thinking about how I'm gonna apply some of these topics that came up today into my own practice when I am engaging with folks and getting folks to think a little bit deeper. So thank you all.
Thank you, Nicolette. Abigail Nelson.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm really just honored to be part of this discussion. I've also, to echo many others, feel really inspired and have learned a lot already, and really a lot to think about in terms of myself, my work with students, and certainly my role here at Bates. I am not a person whose brain works in the way that I can very quickly process and respond to things. So Dr. Sanford kind of gave us permission to prepare a little bit something that we felt was relevant, in our own area. And so I'm going to start there and kind of zoom out a little bit. But I do want to circle back to some of the things that have been shared because they've just made me think. Either it's really resonated or just made me think in a really different way. But I think so I am in the Office of Accessible Education. So I'm usually talking about access in terms of disability. And I think in the context of this conversation tonight, it's just critical to acknowledge that racism and ableism are so interlinked. They really can't be detached, when we're having this conversation. So, we know that institutions of higher education, including Bates, are built on racist systems, structures, and values that are intentionally designed to exclude people of color. We know the same is true for the K through 12 system in the United States. And these systems are also designed to keep people with certain types of bodies and brains, out of the academy. And both systems really privilege one way of learning, one way of demonstrating knowledge. In this case, to go back to Dr. Chaddock's words, use their words, those who can kind of fit the language of the academy is certainly privileged in this space. So I think bringing it back to the pedagogy angle, when we teach to that typical or kind of average learner and make adjustments or accommodations for those on the, air quotes, margins, we really are centering, I'll say white, non-disabled, cisgender, middle upper class, male students, right, who are fluent in this language of the academy, among other characteristics. But when we implement, anti-racist and anti-ableist approaches and really center, and not only center, but, and I've heard this from other folks on the panel tonight, really empower those who are in the quote unquote margins, we're creating this more inclusive environment that actually bolsters all students. And with this approach really eliminates the need for any student to ask for an accommodation, which is what we want to happen. So we want to not have to, my office to not have to exist here. And very clearly the burden is on us, meaning, Bates, in all of our different roles, to really disrupt this and to design our assessments, our writing assignments, and evaluation standards, our policies and programs more broadly, speaking to eliminate these barriers in the first place. And so I think, again, I'm just thinking so much hearing from the panelists tonight about ways in which to do this. I really, Dr. Garrison talked about standardized exams, and that makes me think just so much about our students and timed exams at Bates. And that is, by far the most common accommodation that's requested. I see timed assessments as one of the biggest barriers for students here. And something that I had not even considered is something that Dr. Elisante shared, which was this idea of having to edit yourself. And that made me think about, if a student is taking an exam with a time constraint and they feel that they have to produce something that is editing themselves, they're going through this almost additional process that other students may, don't have to. And so they may need more time. And so I just hadn't thought of extended time in that way. I mean, we have a lot of students coming and asking for extended time for various reasons. I'm sorry, my dog is making an appearance. But we also have students coming and requesting accommodations for, grammar and spelling errors not to be counted in their grade. And so I think, again, this is giving me so much to think about, in terms of how we can move forward with making our curriculum and our programs and the way that my office works with students across the board, more inclusive.
Thank you, Abigail. And Eliana Alcansul.
Thank you everyone for everything that you've shared. My name is Liana Gonçal. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an international student from Jordan, and my native language is Arabic. I am the multilingual writing student manager and a general writing tutor at ARC. And I'm super excited about everything that everyone's shared and really bringing this conversation to even like bigger platforms at Bates. This is definitely not something that a lot of students come in here with the knowledge of, and it's not something that they understand early on, or at least we don't have the terms or the frames of reference to put these topics into. And so when I took a short-term class with Stephanie and Dan my freshman year, I came into that class. It was a class about talking about tutoring and writing. And I was like, great, I'm going to go in. They're going to tell me how to what perfect grammar looks like. Going to help me edit people's papers. I'm not very good at grammar. Perfect. I'll learn more. It'll work. And it wasn't like that. And I'm really happy. And I'm really grateful for the fact that it wasn't like that. But as you start to talk more about this, students like myself who are bilingual or multilingual start to sort of understand and visualize those divides, really sharp divides between our experiences and identities, and where they're allowed to be and where they are not. And that definitely translates in the way that we move in academia and in our classes, and the way that we see ourselves are represented in the topics we talk about and the assignments that we get. And sort of the exclusivity that we begin to recognize after we sort of put our experience within this frame of linguistic injustice. Throughout my experience at ARC, I always get students that come in, and as you're talking about editing, it's like they come in and they're like, here you go, fix this. And how can I fix it? How can I make it better? And it's really reflective of the way that academia has really shattered a lot of students' confidence in their personal experience, in their unique identities. And as a person who's experienced this, and also someone that, works with students who also have experienced this, we recognize how we get marked when our accents show up in class, or when our writing isn't perfect and our writing isn't standardized. And that really put a hindrance on the way that we feel that we can participate in class. And we have a lot to say and we have a lot to offer, and our ability and our knowledge with multiple languages or linguistic varieties expands that knowledge even more, and it brings even more to the class. But as we begin to sort of understand this exclusivity, it becomes even harder for us to share that. And that's why I'm really excited about, the fact that we're all sharing this, that we have professors sharing their experiences, because it's a good reminder for students that their experiences are not unique and the problem is systematic. But this is definitely the part where, there are things that we need from our professors, from our faculty, from the systems that we exist in, to make sure that the spaces that we are in and the knowledge that we're giving into academia is being appreciated and not edited in a way that eliminates our voices and our identities. And it starts with conversations like this, and and more importantly, it's conversations in the class, emphasizing that all of those things that we go through are shortcomings of the academia and shortcomings of the academy, and not shortcomings of us or our experience or our knowledge. And these are the parts that we need our faculty's support in. And I'm really appreciative for all the professors that shared the way that they include this in their classes. I'm in some of those professors' classes or have taken those classes, and I definitely have experienced that. And it's always great when these topics are not like sort of in the back of someone's mind, where I'm like, I kind of know this, so I'll do this, and I'll like whisper it to some other students so that they know it as well. But it's something in the middle of class, we talk about it, we all understand it, so that all students feel like they have the safe space, not just to be who they are on the outside, but also for their knowledge and their experience to be able to be expressed in the language that really reminds them of home and who they are. Yeah, that's what I have. Thank you everyone for sharing and giving me the platform to share.
Thank you, Eliana. And thank you everyone for those insights and for all of your thoughts. In our remaining time, we'll turn to a general Q&A for all of our panelists. Bridget will be facilitating this session. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand using the raise hand function in Zoom if you have a question or comment. I also want to encourage you to put your questions or comments into the chat. I'm sure we won't have time to get to everyone's questions and comments in the remaining 20 minutes, but if you want to put a question or comment in the chat, then all of us who are panelists can also be active in the chat, responding to those comments. And I'll invite all of you who are panelists to monitor the chat for places to weigh in. And I will hand off here to Bridget.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just scanning to see. I see Dr. Diaz-Eaton. Do you want to go first? That'd be lovely.
Okay, I have two questions. And I don't know if two is allowed or if I should just pick one. I'll say both, and like if you only respond to one, that's fine. So one of the questions I had to do with introducing this idea really early. I'm teaching a W2 class in which we do quite a few different types of writing techniques, in part because I don't want to instill the idea that there's only one way to communicate about the field of computation and technology. But I still find myself like more comfortable talking about this when I talk about personal narrative or creative writing, as was mentioned before. And I know Dr. Elisante mentioned like starting with positionality, and I wondered if anybody had any sort of early starts to that conversation that might be particularly useful. And there was a second question that I forgot while I was saying the first, and so you win, and I'll put that one in the chat when I remember it again.
Let's see. I know, Dr. Garrison, you talked a lot about, how you sort of do this. Dr. Lyon, you as well, sort of leading a class and infusing it in the class, infusing this kind of linguistic justice approach. So do one of you want to take a first stab at that?
Yes. Let me see how I want to answer. Yeah. I have a visible identity, audible identity. Based on the way I speak and the way I write. So, I use my own experience as part of my positionality, you know. People judge based on how people speak, you know. We don't want to judge, but, you know, we are just wired to judge others. So we have to do a lot of work not to have that judgment toward, you know, other people's identity. Um, I think for me, I invite my students to have a little bit like a meta perspective about the language and grammar that they just take for granted, and, you know, be more curious about um, in general, you know, because grammar becomes just like a hidden code that we never question why it works in that way. But, you know, a lot of linguistic, you know, diverse students actually have to figure out why this is this way. You know, there's a lot of emotional cognitive effort going in. So really, like, you know, um, creating, like, removing the high power hierarchy. It's not that, you know, all the hidden code doesn't mean that you are a superior learner. Meaning, you know, that doesn't mean that your knowledge is more valid, your ways of knowing is more valid, the knower yourself is more valid or superior. And these, you know, minority students who speak other Englishes, other varieties, you know, their ways of knowing are equally valid. Um, their knowledge is also equally valid, and the knowers themselves are equally valid. So I approach kind of three components, you know, knowledge and way of knowing in the knower in the context of language use. Um, yeah, that's, I use that as kind of community building process. This, we, you know, we are in the learning community. Inherently, there might be, you know, power hierarchy that is created without naming what may be happening in terms of language use. You know, for those who are more comfortable with their English grammar may share more, they share more samples more, then automatically that gets, you know, other language, you know, variety users feel like marginalized, feeling like I cannot share my language, you know, my ideas. So kind of paying attention to the power dynamic earlier on, so that we can have the equal power and be aware of the, you know, potentially perpetuating linguistic hierarchy in classroom.
Thanks. Dr. Lyon, do you want to add to that? Or, oh, are you frozen, Dr. Lyon? Might be.
I'm just going to jump in and say that I'm putting a link in the chat to the presentation that I went over, which has some resources at the end that offer some pedagogical strategies. And they'll resonate with what you've heard from our panelists too, and perhaps help you think of other ways of applying in your classroom.
Yeah.
While we're waiting for Dr. Lyon, I just wanted to say, I think one of the things that we're not great at is reaching into other disciplines that have done this particularly well, right? So I teach in theater. And so the ways in which students have access to authentic lived experiences, lingual cultural realities, and their own languages of expression, they show up in really neat ways in theater, if it's done well. I've also experienced Shakespeare, just to be clear. But, you know, I think that there are ways that we're not potentially thinking about this in a unidisciplinary way, and that we might be thinking about it across or interdisciplinarily. Just a thought. Hi, Jacqueline, we were waiting for you. Oh, I think she's frozen again. Ooh.
I'm here.
I think you're cutting. Is there a problem with the sound, or is it just me?
There's a problem with the sound.
Okay, sorry. Dr. Alessandri, I know you also talked about this. Do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah. We start the class, and the first thing we after we kind of get to know each other and look at the syllabus, we start talking about positionality. And this semester, our students are building social identity maps. as a first assignment, and then a spinoff of that is to write a social identity autobiography, which is really like, let's get deep down into positionality. And that's a first assignment. So it's an opportunity for them, I think, to really take a deep dive into their own positionality. The flip side of that assignment is it gives me an opportunity as the person who's going to be interacting with their writing for the rest of the semester or the module to know who they are and where they are, and how that position is going to be reflected in their writing for the rest of our time together. And what I hope is that I've created a safe enough space in which they know that the things they've shared in this social identity autobiography, that they can reference those things in future writings, or they can write from those spaces, and I will know where they're coming from, or know to the extent that I can know where they're coming from.
Thank you. Eliana, I'm curious, do you have were there any assignments or anything that you've done in classes that you felt like you could, let you delve into your linguistic repertoire?
I mean, my most experience has definitely been in just the class that is talking about it. So I don't think that might be helpful, but I think for most of my other classes, I think from a student perspective, it's so much more helpful when it's a very explicit thing being said. Like, we are working on those things because there are those issues in the system, rather than making it an individual issue where we all have our unique voices and let's talk about them, because that's really helpful. But what I experience from students coming into art is that doesn't resonate with them as something that's going to help them succeed, or something that's going to help students be able to write better, because we've been conditioned to believe that writing well is just looks one certain way within academia. And I think for classes where we have been very intentional about talking about we are going to talk about language, and that's some of the first things that we approach in a class, it's so much more helpful because it builds the tone for the rest of the class to be something that I recognize that this professor is open about this and has approached this type of issue in the way that they teach, and I won't be penalized for using my home language or for exploring my identity in my writing. And I think most of the students that come to ARC are kind of I want to pass this. I just want to pass this assignment. I just want to fix it. And that's because even if the professor sort of has allowed for that sort of identity exploration in the writing, the students are probably not aware of it, or they're still scared, or they think they just said that, but I'm not really going to do anything about it right now because I don't want to lose points. I might as well just still write in the standard English. So I personally, from a student perspective, I just find it to be really helpful when it's a very open and explicit conversations about the shortcoming of academia, and the way that the professor sort of plans on tackling that. And that definitely invites sort of the feedback and the experience of the students. That's always that's the whole point of the class. And so it helps the professor sort of build their approach to it around that.
Can I pipe in one more time on this topic? And so also having the students engage in really savvy rhetorical reading so that they can see that this idea of a standard English is really mythological, and that the writing they're reading is code meshed in ways already, and also give them opportunities to think and talk critically about the academic jargon and propose alternatives. Because we know one of the problems with academic writing is it's so exclusive that it hasn't moved out into the world. And it's one of the reasons why we have so many problems everywhere. And so engaging in that critique of the academic language and then giving them opportunities to use their voices and visions and values and epistemology and aesthetics to say what matters in ways that are more varied and diverse, bringing in all those dialects. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Lisa Gilson. You have your hand up and you want to ask your question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated all the presentation and everyone who's spoken today. I've been thinking a lot about how I structure my assignments, and particularly I've been trying to rewrite my syllabi to have it focus on skill building. And those skill building exercises often focus on something that scholars do, or like, what does writing in political theory look like? And so I have a lot of, and these are skills in the sense of like, what does it look like to research a historical context? What does it look like to do all of these things? But I feel like in trying to teach skills, I guess I have two questions about this. In trying to teach these skills, especially in intro classes, I feel like I give them examples that are diverse in the sense they don't look exactly the same way, and they are written by authors with different diverse identities. But I'm not sure that I can, like, there's something about the language around skill building that makes it sound as though there's one way to do something. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. And then the second is more of a pragmatic or practical thing. So when I sort of build up to a shorter paper in my course, I've been thinking about how, so that not just about grammar and language, but also how, like, sort of multilingual backgrounds have different ways of structuring arguments. And so it isn't just like on a intra-paragraph level. It's also about how overall you can see this. And this is because I'm coming from a like white dominated, white supremacist background in academia. It's hard for me. It's very hard. I have 40 students in my intro class. It's very hard for me to read something where the argument doesn't come first and there isn't a roadmap sentence. And so I've signaled to my students, I want to see an argument in the first paragraph. I want to see a roadmap sentence in the first paragraph. And so some of this, and I explain what that is, and I give them examples of what that looks like. There is there are some differences in the examples that I use, but they're all doing that thing of showing it in the first paragraph. And since that's not necessarily part of all linguistic traditions, I had a French student who was like, actually, we get to the argument at the end. That's how I'm used to doing it. I don't know how to do that from my own, like, I can't, it's hard for me. It's very hard for me to grade that many papers, period. And then, or to assess that many and give feedback on that many papers, period, much less go through the process of trying to read and analyze something where I don't have it according to something that's upfront. And I know that that is a weakness in me, and maybe I can do a better job of communicating that. But I guess I'm asking a question of like, how would you approach that given this conversation, given what I'm hearing about how structure itself, like even thinking about it from a structural standpoint of how to write a paper that might be sort of reflecting my sort of preconceived notions about what is good writing.
I think I can start answering this before I get kicked off again. But I would say, like, one, be kinder to yourself a little bit. Like, just because we're sitting here doesn't mean that we have all the answers or solutions, because I think this conversation has really shown that this is not a sort of something that can be tackled in the space of a single course or in a single assignment. I would say, like, for myself, right, it gets to some of the tensions between trying to undermine and provide alternatives and open up spaces for alternative forms of writing, and also, we can think about other writing practices that are not necessarily papers as well, which I encourage students to do as well. But the tensions of trying to open up those spaces, but acknowledging that we don't control sort of the wider context in which students' writing is evaluated, and that our classrooms can be spaces where we try and attempt, and maybe a lot of that work is unlearning, right? Necessarily before learning, but as Ileana pointed out, that there's also sort of challenges, right, with students who don't have enough models or enough spaces or enough support, right, to really embrace a kind of alternative writing practice, or find a sense of voice and things like that. And so I would say, I think for me, I operate within that tension that there are conventions that definitely appear in my writing and assignments, at the same time providing alternatives and questioning, right, those conventions at the same time, because I do feel like, okay, it's one thing to say, let's throw this all out, and another thing to ensure that students either are comfortable with being able to complete an assignment, right, because they've learned this throughout all their educational experience, but also have the skills to function in other spaces.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have to start to wrap up. Maybe we have room for one more comment from a panelist if they'd like to respond to this idea of how do we do this and live within that tension? How do we bring these voices into our classrooms? Eliana?
Yeah, I think just quickly, from my perspective, I think having, for example, I'm also a psychology major, and so having to be in a psychology class and here are all the things you need to do to write in the psychology discipline. Hearing that and having to write it is a much different and harder experience than hearing that from the professor, hearing that we all agree that these are arbitrary rules that are made to benefit certain people and not others, and then having to learn them and write that. It's like I recognize that, like, now I have to do this, but I at least know I'm in a safe space to not feel like I'm being judged for my inability to like instantly know how to do any of this or instantly be perfect in using this like standardized language. And so I think it's just a case of creating a safe space where both the students and professors can feel like they can talk about this and recognize where those systems come from and have space to explore their home languages. And obviously in the end, for students, after we leave this institution, we have to survive in the world that is outside, and we have to survive in the fields that we go into, and having those skills are important. But having them and not being like scarred by them in the way that they affect our identity is like a helpful way of going about it.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's the time we have. There are no easy answers here. There's an intensive dialogue that all of us have to have in our disciplines and as a community and as a college. But we don't have to be complicit in perpetuating a discriminatory system. This is the start, not the end of this dialogue. So please look for announcements of upcoming events that will continue to explore this topic. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your time and insight. And thank you so much to all of you who came to add to this discussion. Thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Good night, all.